I would think it remains true that Gore Vidal still seems a very mixed bag to many serious readers whom I know. He once told me that he thought that his exclusion from the university canon had something to do with his overt homoeroticism, but I always found that a rather dubious kind of assertion, since invariably throughout the history of the world, such a remarkably high percentage of the major writers have been homoerotic in their orientation. He is so good an entertainer, both on and off the page, that may at times get in the way of people's perception of what it is that in fact he's achieved in his writing.
What do you think his strengths are as a novelist?
Well, Vidal has two very different modes of strength or ability as a writer of narrative fiction, and he never has been able to bring them together. He is primarily a historical novelist, and probably we are past the point where, with very rare exceptions, historical novels can be taken with the highest seriousness by many readers. They seem, in a sense, outmoded or coming from another time in every sense. And the other is, of course, wickedly satiric in both senses, satyric, as well as satire, of which the most famous and the best is certainly Myra Breckinridge, but which would include works like Duluth and Myron and the not very scintillating, at least to me, Live from Golgotha. And there have been other works in that mode by him. And I do remember remarking when I wrote something extensive about his novel Lincoln, that it was a sort of sorrow to me, and I suppose I still feel that way, that you could not have a work by Vidal which would somehow combine or fuse the modes of Myra Breckinridge and of Lincoln or Burr. But I suppose that not only would lie beyond his abilities, but really lie beyond anybody's ability, since the modes are antithetical. They would cancel one another out. The serious issue, I think, is the whole question of whether a historical novel, which really foregrounds its historicism, can be easily accepted by, what shall we say, whatever advanced readers, whatever strong or authentic readers we have left. There are exceptions, but they don't necessarily foreground their historical aspect. Thus, a great novel, in my judgment, is The Blood Meridian of Cormac McCarthy, certainly his finest work, and one of the most astonishing works by a living American writer that actually takes place in two periods separated by a couple of decades. on the Mexican-Texas border in the mid-19th century, a bit earlier than that even. And it's a book that I've read repeatedly and written a good deal about. I never have the sense, as I read it, when I'm in the midst of reading it, that this is a historical novel. It's too appalling and overwhelming in its immediacy, too shocking for that. Since Vidal does take on the burden of the historical novelist, in a sense, he willingly competes with historians, since most of our historians do not write very well at all. On the whole, I prefer to read Vidal, at least in selected works. Certainly, even though I have friends, a couple of them Lincoln scholars, who insist to me that the view of Lincoln in Vidal's novel of that title is very much distorted. I find myself very persuaded by the book.
Let's talk a little about Lincoln. You wrote that what Vidal is in Lincoln is a masterly American historical novelist who has found his truest subject, which is our national political history, when our political and military histories were one thing and one thing only, the unwavering will of Abraham Lincoln to keep the states united. Vidal's imagination of American politics then and now is so powerful as to compel awe. Those are your words.
Well, the primary strength of Gore Vidal as a historical novelist seems to me to be his obsession with American power politics. And it is somewhat convincing to me that he finds the beginning of our imperial presidency with Abraham Lincoln, who, after all, did suspend habeas corpus, and who did very much take the law into his own hands, and who held the country together at a very high price in blood. I've always wondered about that, though I don't know that this kind of wonder has much to do overtly with Vidal's novel, Lincoln. I mean, one always wonders, had Lincoln not been elected, or had some person of lesser strength and will and drive been elected, and the South had seceded anyway, and that president had been content to let the South go, what would the subsequent history of the United States have been like? I mean, the revenge of the South is partly why we have our hideous current politics. You know, the Southern Republican Party is the dominant wing of the party, and in some sense has been governing the rest of us for some time now. It's no accident that our president is a sort of transplanted Texan, that the heads of the Republican Party in the House are from Texas, that the Senate minority leader, as he is now, and may he remain minority leader, is the abominable Trent Lott of Mississippi. The revenge of the South upon the rest of us is the post-Reagan Republican Party. And perhaps if the South had been allowed to depart in peace, it would have been better. Sooner or later, they would have had to come back. Sooner or later, they would have had to abolish slavery on their own. No Western country was going to go into the closing years of the 19th century and maintain legal slavery. It would have been impossible. But this hasn't got much to do with Gore Vidal.
No. How does Vidal's portrayal of Lincoln differ from other more widely accepted portraits?
What I find most interesting about Vidal's Lincoln is that he really does seem to be there, warts and all. His curious secular mysticism is present, his profound fatalism, his extraordinary political shrewdness, and deep understanding of how to manipulate others in order to secure his own power for what he took to be the purposes of the nation, and the peculiar darkness of his nature, including that very opaque marriage to Mary Todd Lincoln. That comes through very strongly in the book. But as I say, I have good friends who are great admirers of Lincoln, including of Lincoln's own writing, who are very angry about the book.
It's odd. I think that he does demystify Lincoln, but I don't think he's tearing Lincoln apart. I mean, I think he admires him. That's what I don't understand why the historians are...
I think that in a complex way, the book does show what might be called Vidal's cold and unloving admiration for Lincoln. His Lincoln is not a national myth, or the beloved father Abraham, or the martyr of our final emergence as a nation state. It's a remarkably effective dramatic portrait, whether or not it is wholly true to a particular scholar's interpretation of the historical Lincoln or not. There is considerable ambivalence, I think, in Vidal's treatment of Lincoln in the book, but that probably makes it more interesting when you simultaneously have great affection for and some considerable revulsion for the same person, and you manage to get both of them onto the page as effectively as Vidal does there. It makes a curious contrast with Burr, which is almost as good a novel, which is, I think, second best among the more sort of standard, or at least the novels of American history by Vidal. But there, because the ambivalence is not there, because he wholeheartedly all but identifies himself with Burr, the empathy is so strong that it is probably less interesting and certainly less complex kind of a portrait.
For one thing, it seems to me that in Burr, what's beautiful about Lincoln is he presents him from all these points of view, people who adored him and people who disliked him, which gives this, multi-dimensional view of Lincoln.
Well, what we forget is what Vidal reminds us of very effectively, which is that Lincoln was at least as widely hated, even in the North, during his own lifetime, as he was loved or admired, that there was always enormous resentment and distrust of him. And that comes across very effectively in the book. The book is a puzzle, I think, to me in the end. I haven't read it in a number of years, but I read it twice very carefully before I reviewed it, and I went back to it a couple of times after that. I think what makes it, in the end, a strong work is that one frequently feels in reading Vidal that the book doesn't get away from him enough, that he keeps his two hands firmly on it and knows too well what he is doing. In the case of Lincoln, I think Lincoln got away from him to a certain extent, and you get a kind of dramatic quality suggesting that the figure, without necessarily merging completely with the historical Lincoln, whoever he may have been, that the figure both is and is not what Vidal wants him to be. That is to say, some energy, perhaps creative energy in Vidal, does break loose there. The only other place in his writing where that seems to me to happen, where you get a kind of wonderfully uncontrolled exuberance side by side with a powerfully held-in exuberance, is in Myra Breckinridge, which becomes perfectly hilarious and really spins out of control. And the wild energy of it is a kind of delight, though there also, I haven't reread the book in many years.
But you did write that it, on even with the times that you had read it at the time that you wrote the piece that I read, that it's continued to give wicked pleasure. Why is that?
Well, it is a work I would still endorse for wicked pleasure, and I hope sometime I will find my copy of it and read it again. Partly there is a kind of delight throughout Myra in exploiting the fundamental androgyny that, after all human beings possess to one degree or another. I mean, it doesn't benefit Vidal or any other writer to mention him in the same breath as William Shakespeare, but Shakespeare's fundamental insight into all of us, or one of his fundamental insights, is the androgynous quality in all human beings. And of course, I've always found both amusing and wise Vidal's argument that it's foolish to talk about human beings as being either heterosexual or homosexual. One can only speak about human beings and say that there are some of them who prefer the other gender, and some of them who prefer their own gender, and some of whom sexually are attracted to both.
You said a wonderful thing about that that I love, where you said that after you explained that, you said that the sort of polemic of Myra is the burden of Myra Breckinridge, but a burden born with lightness, wildness, abandon, joy, skill.
Oh, yes. The best thing about Myra as a book is not only that to some extent it gets away from Vidal, but that it's not a tendentious book at all. It's full of joy. It's full of a kind of wicked glee at everything it portrays, including its satirical portrait of various Hollywood figures. But its mockery also of gender roles has a kind of permanent pleasure built into it. It's a book, I think, that does people good. There are so few books of that kind. It was once a definite strain in American literature. The great master of it was Nathaniel West in Miss Lonely Hearts and The Day of the Locust, and to some extent A Cool Million. And there was Terry Southern in The Magic Christian, but Terry stopped writing, or didn't write very much after that, and then died. One doesn't really see much in that particular vein that Vidal was so effective in Myra. I didn't much like Duluth, and I was not happy with Live from Golgotha. One feels perhaps it's too late in the day, he must believe, to go back to that vein now. Perhaps he's just not interested in it anymore. But I suppose something in me still wonders if it wouldn't be possible for him, as his historical series more and more approaches the present, if some of that wickedness were not allowed to manifest itself in some historical novel yet to be written by him. I must say that to this day, of the public performances of Gore Vidal that I've seen, what I most delight in were his exchanges on television. I guess it was the Democratic Convention where everything went to pieces. Was that 1968? It was the year that Hubert Humphrey got nominated, and William Buckley and Vidal were on together and came close to murdering one another. I thought that was a very delightful exchange, and I myself favored Vidal, and still do.
When Myra Breckinridge was published, and that came out in '68.
Oh, I didn't know that.
I thought shocking.
I wouldn't say that back in 1968, Myra was considered a shocking book. It was a little startling. It was, after all, in a recognizable American vein of satire, and one that I wish we had more recent examples of. But by 1968, I don't think very much could shock anyone anymore. The counterculture had been raging since at least 1965 or 1966 or so. I don't know that one realized in 1968, and it's now 34 years later, that it was going to so triumph that now we have no culture except the counterculture. I mean, we don't have universities anymore. We have the counterculture. The media are just part of the counterculture. The universities are part of the media. I keep telling people here, though they don't like to hear me say it, that we should call ourselves a mediaversity rather than a university.
One thing I wanted to...
Erica, maybe one of you should go out and see
Right.
if they could give us 15 minutes.
Yeah, even
Who?
the people...
Oh, no, you haven't got a chance, kids. You haven't got a chance. Those are professional.
I don't like to use women in that way, but...
Well, why not?
Why not? This is
Why not?
important.
So let's go on.
Well, you had, going back to oh, well, let me, while you're on the line of the comic invention or comedy strain, someone said that Gore Vidal comes from two streams, in American literary ancestry, Henry James and Mark Twain. Would you
I was thinking about Twain before, though not using his name, when I was talking about Myra and about that sort of rancid side in Gore Vidal. There is a very authentic strain of...
1 moment, I'm sorry. 10 minutes. Okay, great.
Oh, amazing. They obviously fell for you, child. There's a very authentic strain of the Mark Twain, whom I love best, at his most outrageous. There are two wonderful short pieces by Mark Twain, one of which I reprinted recently in an anthology. It's called Journalism in Tennessee, and begins when somebody enters the offices of the Johnson County Morning Glory and War Whoop, where he rapidly observes all sorts of gunplay taking place between the editors of rival Tennessee newspapers. And then there's another fierce piece called Cannibalism in the Cars, in which in the early days of the railroad in upstate New York, a train gets stranded in the snow, and under the circumstances, the passengers cast lots and start to eat one another. Vidal has a definite relationship to that side of Twain, the side that brings forth that curious book called The Mysterious Stranger. I'm not so sure that Henry James seems to me a kind of literary precursor of Vidal, though Vidal obviously might like to think so. The Henry Adams, of the historical novels is actually closer. James's imagination is not moved by politics, not even Princess Casamassima. It just really does not interest him at all. Whereas Henry Adams is obsessed with it, as Vidal is. Louis Auchincloss, who stems from Edith Wharton more than he does from James, is a sort of gentler companion in some of his historical novels to Vidal.
Yeah, I think of Gore Vidal as our current Henry Adams.
Yeah, it would be legitimate if you think of Henry Adams as a novelist to think of Gore Vidal as the closest thing to a current successor to Henry Adams in terms of a novel like Democracy. I don't know that the other side of Henry Adams, the religious and speculative side, shows up in Vidal. Vidal is a cheerfully secular writer, which is one of the things that's wrong with Live from Golgotha. He really can't take what he's satirizing seriously enough to do a proper job on it.
Well, I think Gore Vidal is very interested in religion, but he's not mystical at all. So that's where his similarity to Henry Adams splits. You wrote that there's a split in Vidal between the man of letters who has a friendly contempt for politicians and the born political man who would make a remarkable senator.
I think I do remember wondering why Vidal had not been more successful in politics. Of course, the obvious cause, as he himself said the one time we discussed it, is that a professedly homoerotic candidate in those days did not get very far. It would be less of a problem now, I would think. I mean, Barney Frank regularly gets reelected from his rather enlightened Massachusetts district. But I would think that at his age, Vidal would not want to waste any more time on electoral politics.
He always says that though he was in a way bred to be a politician, and would have liked to have been, that he was born to be a writer. And you can't do both.
Let's see, have there been... Well, it's not quite true. The refutation of Vidal saying that while he was bred to be a politician, but was born to be a writer, and that he didn't think you could do both, there is Benjamin Disraeli.
That's the only one he gives.
A very great and successful politician, and a rather effective novelist. Sybil is quite a book, and some of the others are not bad. But I would suppose that Disraeli is the only major exception that I can think of. And Disraeli and Vidal are very different personages. in every way.
Well, Disraeli's the only one that he says.
Oh,
He says, and don't mention Winston Churchill, because he was a terrible writer. Do you think that Vidal's upbringing in political Washington gives him an edge in his understanding of Lincoln as a politician?
I'm not sure that I would ascribe any of Vidal's insights to his upbringing or his ancestry or the context that he's always known so well. There is a kind of primal zest for political embroilment, which seems to be present in his personality. Not that I know the personality very well, but mostly as one gets to know it through the writing. It is, I suppose, a little surprising to me that, gifted as he is, he has not achieved more books as strong in their very different ways as Lincoln and Burr on the one side and Myra on the other. I'm fascinated by the figure of Julian the Apostate, so I found Julian of some considerable interest, though I'm not so sure that the treatment is as interesting as the figure himself. And probably Ibsen, in that huge play, Emperor and Galilean, which I'm sure Vidal knows, probably did better with Julian as a character than Vidal could. Creation has a very interesting kind of speculative imagination moving through it. And I guess I prefer it to most of Vidal's other books. But I wonder if, as a professional writer, he hasn't been, in a sense, driven to write too much. One fears sometimes that he has scattered his gift in too many directions, in too many places, that he's diffused his energies. But that may be an illusion on one's part. I mean, people in the end only do what they can do. Their limitations are necessarily indistinguishable, finally, from their strengths. And he has done as well as all but a few. I mean, I could not turn to him as readily as I reread Cormac McCarthy or Philip Roth or Thomas Pynchon or Don DeLillo among current novelists. But I just as soon reread Gore Vidal as reread Saul Bellow or most of the others.
For what do you think he will be remembered?
What is most memorable about Vidal? The personality, of course, has great public fascination, and doubtless, if one knew him, great private fascination. And insofar as the personality gets into the books, as it certainly does in Myra, it produces, I think, permanent work. I don't know whether the historical novel as a genre or as a subdivision of a genre will make a return in people's sensibilities. It's so puzzling now in the 21st century to know whether literature in the traditional sense has a future at all. So it's very hard to make secular prophecies of that kind. I sometimes wonder if Vidal would not have written more memorably had he been more of a romancer, as it were, by which I mean if instead of writing the novel as a form, particularly the historical novel, he had worked more in the mode of historical romance, the sort of thing that Sir Walter Scott did so well, though of course we don't read Scott nowadays, though a book like The Heart of Midlothian is an extraordinary book, or Red Gauntlet. But one feels that, except with Lincoln and to some extent Burr, the representation of deep inward human character and personality is not really part of Vidal's gift. That he can be a lot more vivid at representing places and atmospheres and states of being, as it were, and political climates than the richness of an individual personality, though Lincoln is the exception, and Burr may or may not be an exception, I'm not sure. I would have to know Vidal fairly well, and I don't at all, to know whether or not Burr is a kind of self-portrait, as I suspect it is.
Well, he always denies that.
I didn't know that.
But I definitely see Gore in Burr. And, you know, as he would say, well, realists are always hated, you know, and he's definitely a realist, and he thinks Aaron Burr was a realist.
What does it mean to call Aaron Burr a realist, or to call Vidal a realist? I'm not sure. I don't really know much more about the historical Burr than I have absorbed in reading Vidal's novel. I don't know that by literary temperament, the author of the books by Vidal that I've read through the years strikes me as being a realist in the sense, say, that Zola is a realist, or Theodore Dreiser is a realist. He's not a naturalist or a naturalistic writer of that sort at all. There is an element of a fantasist in him. There is a gift for, well, it goes back to the other statement that I made. There is a gift for romance writing and for sustained fantasy in him, which is why perhaps I'm just rephrasing my nostalgic notion that if only he could have fused the sort of thing he did in Myra with the sort of thing he did in Lincoln, antithetical as those strands are, he would have broken through to a clearer importance than he necessarily seems to have. But I'm not basing that on academic considerations, even though I am a lifelong... oh, I hadn't realized. Which phone is ringing? Oh, that's the fax phone. Okay. It means a fax is coming through. It'll stop in a moment.
Let me just wait a sec.
It must be the fax phone. Yes. How strange. I better get rid of it or it's going to go on to this, but I don't know how it came on again. Ooh. So, where are we there?
Well,
I think we probably pretty much covered what little part of the Vidal waterfront.
Right. One more question. You mentioned about his standing in the, in the academy, in the academic world, and
well, I don't think he really has much standing in the academic world, but that cuts no ice with me one way or the other. When I was a young teacher here at Yale almost half a century ago, I was engaged in a constant struggle against the academic new critics, as they were then called, sort of neo-Christian critics of T.S. Eliot's school. And then after that, I found myself in an endless struggle against French-oriented critics. And then, since then, it's a hopeless and bloody struggle against the total destruction of the universities and colleges in the English-speaking world in cultural matters, because they have been taken over by considerations of gender, ethnicity, race. They have been politicized abominably. And we have so-called cultural studies now, which have replaced literary study. I fear, and I'm sure that Vidal would hardly be pleased by this, since he wishes to be judged by aesthetic standards and cognitive standards. I fear that if he survives in academic circles, it will be in the same mad way that Thomas Mann, a very great writer, is now taught and appreciated mostly because they have taken him out of the closet. And so Mann's barely repressed homoeroticism seems to be what interests people most in him. One would hate to see Vidal preserved as a homoerotic novelist per se, but I'm reasonably sure he wouldn't want that either. But it really doesn't matter, you know. I don't know where literary criticism is to be found anymore. There's very little of it around. There's just about none, I repeat, in the academic institutions of the English-speaking world. There certainly is nothing out there in the so-called public sphere. I mean, the New York Times Book Review cannot be called literary criticism, and for my money, the New York Review of Books can't be called either, which is why I gave up writing for them a long time ago. We don't have literary standards anymore. So,
on that note, some people think that Gore Vidal will be remembered most as an essayist. And do you have any opinion about?
Vidal is certainly an interesting essayist. He is a fierce polemicist. And again, that tremendous energy of discourse that he summons can be highly entertaining. But he's not, by and large, a personal essayist, is he? I mean, he's not going to be the next Montaigne, or oddly enough, the next Freud, since I think that's what Freud will survive as sort of the Montaigne of the 20th century. He is very much a political essayist and a social commentator in his essays. I don't know what the survival value of that would be either. But I think almost all questions, I mean, here I am, someone who has spent my life trying to define canonical standards and to exemplify them and to fight for them. I don't know that we really have them anymore. I mean, I'm very conscious of the fact, as I would put it, that we have lost the war, and that anything one can do now is just, you know, guerrilla action, rearguard action. Aesthetically and cognitively speaking, literary judgments are are lost in the wasteland of our contemporaries.